Month 11. I am writing this from a station that smells like recycled air and alien fear. I want to get this right, not for history, for myself. Because I was there at the beginning, and I need to understand how we ended up here. My name is Cale Marin. I was a diplomat. I poured coffee on the morning the galaxy declared war on us, and I remember thinking the coffee tasted like burned plastic, the way it always did on Conclave Station Varath. And I remember that being the last ordinary thought I had for a very long time. The broadcast came through every screen on the station simultaneously. 14 species, represented by their flags and their formal colors, seated in the Grand Conclave Chamber. The speaker was a Vreth elder, tall and pale, with 4 arms folded neatly across his chest, the posture of someone delivering information they consider already resolved. His translated voice was calm, almost kind. He said that humanity represented a biological and cultural risk to galactic civilization. He said that Earth's history of internal conflict, disease, and instability demonstrated a species incapable of integration. He said the Vreth Dominion, acting in the interests of all peaceful species, was formally declaring a state of war against the human race. He gave us 72 hours to surrender. Then the screens went back to their normal displays, and I was sitting in the cafeteria, holding a cup of burned plastic coffee, and every alien in that room was looking at me. Not with anger. That would have been easier. They looked at me the way you look at something that doesn't know yet, that it's already finished. Pity, mixed with discomfort, the expression of people who would rather not be watching, but cannot look away. I contacted Earth immediately. It took 4 minutes for the signal to travel. The response came back in 7, which meant someone had been waiting for this call, had already composed a reply, and had sent it before I finished speaking. The message said, "Stay where you are, document everything, and do not make any statements on behalf of Earth without authorization." Then, at the very end, almost as if it had been added as an afterthought by someone who had thought about it a great deal, the message said, "We are not surprised." I read that last line 3 times. Then I put my coffee down and started writing in my journal, because I had a feeling that whatever came next was going to be the kind of thing people would want a record of. The Vreth Dominion had been among the stars for 40,000 years. I want you to hold that number in your mind for a moment, because it is almost impossible to actually understand. When the first Vreth starship left its home planet, humanity was painting animals on cave walls. While we were building our first cities, they were already charting distant galaxies. When our first empires rose and fell and rose again, they were settling their 1,000th world. They had ended their last war 8,000 years ago, 8,000 years of unbroken peace. In that time, they had built political systems of such careful, elegant balance that conflict between member species had become genuinely unthinkable. They had solved resource scarcity. They had cured their most dangerous diseases. They had evolved, slowly and deliberately, into something that looked very much like the kind of civilization humans had always dreamed of becoming. And they looked at us, with our 10,000 years of written history, packed full of wars and plagues and collapses and recoveries, and they saw something broken. They were wrong, but I understand why they thought what they thought. The fleet arrived at the edge of the solar system on the 4th day. 400 ships. I saw the sensor data from the station, relayed through civilian channels that had not yet been restricted, and even at a distance the scale of it was difficult to process. Each of those vessels was larger than anything humanity had ever built. Their engines alone put out more energy than entire cities. They were, by any objective measurement, the most powerful military force that had ever pointed itself at Earth. They broadcast their final message: surrender, or watch strategic locations burn. Earth's response went out on every open frequency, in every language the Dominion had provided in their translation databases. We have been expecting something like this. Come ahead. I heard later that the Dominion's translation systems flagged the phrase as anomalous. The words were clear enough, but the context made no sense. Their databases did not contain a record of any species, in 40,000 years of recorded galactic history, responding to an ultimatum of this kind, with what their systems could only classify as an invitation. They fired. They destroyed a satellite network and a research installation on Mars. The attack was precise, surgical, and designed to demonstrate capability without causing mass casualties. It was the opening move of a war they expected to last 11 days. Earth responded in 9 minutes. I did not see what happened next directly. What I saw was the reaction on Conclave Station, the sudden silence that fell over every alien in the building when the reports started coming through, the way a Vreth communications officer put down her equipment and stood very still for almost a minute before picking it back up again. What I learned, piece by piece, over the days that followed, was that humanity fought in a way the Dominion's models could not predict. Not because our technology was better. In raw terms, it was far inferior. But 40,000 years of peace produces a military that is optimized for the kind of war that follows rules. Ours had been built by people who had never agreed on the rules. Earth's weapons programs, running simultaneously across dozens of nations that did not fully trust each other, had produced technology that was inconsistent, improvised, and deeply strange. Some of it barely functioned. Some of it functioned in ways that even the engineers who built it did not entirely understand. The Dominion's battle computers, designed to model enemy behavior based on rational military doctrine, kept generating predictions that turned out to be wrong. What troubled the Dominion most was not our weapons, it was our soldiers. I read the medical reports later, after everything ended, and documents began to be declassified. Dominion medical observers, studying humans captured during the early stages of the conflict, sent back assessments that were passed up their chain of command, with increasing urgency. One phrase appeared repeatedly across different reports, written by different physicians from different species, all arriving at the same observation independently. They continue. A Dominion soldier who sustained a certain level of injury was removed from combat. This was not a cultural choice. It was simply biology. Their bodies communicated damage clearly, and their minds responded by shutting down the behaviors that would cause further damage. It was rational. It was, from a biological standpoint, intelligent. Human soldiers did not work this way. Human soldiers had evolved on a world that spent 4 billion years running a continuous experiment in survival. Every predator that had ever hunted our ancestors, every famine that had nearly ended us, every plague that had swept through our populations, had left something behind in our biology. Not just immunity, something deeper, a kind of refusal, written into our cells, that kept the body functioning at levels that should not have been possible. And when the body was pushed past even that, the mind took over. This was the part that disturbed the Dominion observers most deeply. They had species with great courage in their histories. Courage they understood as fear that had been managed. What they were observing in human soldiers did not look like managed fear. It looked like something they could not name, something that sat in a category their psychology did not have a word for. The Dominion commander who was running the campaign sent a private message to his superiors in month 3. I was not supposed to see it. I saw it anyway. He wrote, "We made a category error. We classified them as primitive because their history is short and violent. We did not consider that the violence is why they are the way they are. These creatures have been killing, and nearly dying, and surviving and rebuilding for as long as they have existed. We are fighting something that has been training for this since before it could speak." By month 4, the Dominion had lost its first capital ship. It had not lost a ship of that class in 4,000 years. On Conclave Station, I became something I had never intended to be. I was the only human in the building. Aliens who had never spoken to me before started appearing at my door, or approaching me in the corridors, asking me questions in low voices, as if they were afraid of being heard asking them. A Vreth senator came to my room one evening, and sat across from me in a chair that was slightly too large for him, and asked, with genuine and careful politeness, whether I could help him understand my species. I asked him what he wanted to know. He thought for a long time. Then he said, "Your people do not appear to have a threshold. Every species we have ever encountered, when threatened beyond a certain point, finds that point and communicates it. They signal that they have reached their limit. Your people do not appear to have a limit. Is this a military strategy, or is it simply how you are?" I thought about it honestly before I answered. I told him it was simply how we were. I told him about the history he had read and interpreted as evidence of corruption. I told him that each of those disasters, each of those wars and collapses and extinctions that had nearly taken us out, had left something in the generations that came after. Not wisdom necessarily. We were not a wise species, and I would not pretend otherwise. But endurance. The specific and terrible endurance of something that has been almost destroyed many times, and has learned, at a level below conscious thought, that the answer is always to keep moving. He looked at me for a long time when I finished. Then he said, very quietly, "That is not a flaw." Month 7 was when the war changed in a way that I still find difficult to write about. I was in the observation room when the reports came in. I watched the Dominion communications officers go silent. Not quiet, the way people get when they are processing information, but completely, absolutely silent, the way people get when what they are hearing does not fit inside any category they have previously constructed. 3 Dominion fleet positions were gone, not destroyed. The Dominion sensors could track destruction. These were simply absent, in a way that their instruments registered but could not explain. A Dominion science officer came to find me afterward. She was a Sarathi, one of the species I had come to trust most during my time on the station. She sat down without being invited and looked at me for a moment before speaking. She asked how long humanity had been developing whatever had been used. I told her I did not know the technical specifics. I told her it had probably started as a theoretical physics problem, maybe 60 years ago, maybe 100. I told her we had run many programs simultaneously, and they had cross-pollinated in ways that were difficult to trace back to a single origin. She asked if it had been developed as a weapon. I said probably not, at the start. We usually stumbled into our most significant capabilities while trying to solve something else. She was quiet for a very long time after that. The conclave fractured in month 8. 3 species voted to continue pushing for Earth's total defeat. 2 voted to open negotiation. The Sarathi called for a pause and began speaking with me privately, in corridors and small rooms, carefully and without witnesses. The Sarathi elder who had been passing me messages was a very old woman named Thasari. She had lived through her own species' near extinction 2,000 years ago, in a war against a larger power that had also assumed the smaller species would simply stop at the appropriate moment. She told me that her people had a word for what humanity was doing. The word did not translate perfectly, but the closest version in my language was something like the refusal. She said it was a quality she had thought existed only in her own people's past. She said she had not expected to see it again. She helped arrange the negotiation. She should receive more credit for what followed than she ever will. I stood in the Grand Conclave Chamber in month 11 and spoke to 14 species, most of whom had never seen a human being in person. I was aware that I was not a general or a scientist. I was a diplomat who had been pouring bad coffee when this started, and I was standing in the most important room in the known galaxy, asking the oldest civilizations in existence to reconsider a decision they had made with enormous confidence. I did not threaten them. I did not perform strength or pretend to a certainty I did not have. I told them the truth. I told them they had looked at our history and seen violence, and concluded we were broken. I told them they had missed what the violence had built. I told them that every plague we had survived had rewritten our biology, and every war had changed how we understood conflict, and every near extinction had carved something into us that their long peace had never required of them. I told them we were not better. I said it plainly, because it was true. In almost every measurable way, they were more advanced, more stable, more careful with themselves and each other. But I told them that they had never had to fight to exist, and we had never done anything else. The room was silent for a long time. Thasari stood and said her people voted for peace. The others followed, one by one, across 3 days of argument that I was not permitted to attend. When the final count was announced, I was in my small room on the station, and I did not feel like celebrating. What I felt was tired in a way that went down to something below exhaustion. And then, underneath the tiredness, something I recognized after a moment as a very old and familiar human feeling. Hope. Not confident hope, not the clean kind you read about, the small, stubborn, irrational kind. The kind that keeps showing up even when the evidence does not particularly support it. The kind that is, I was beginning to understand, one of the things about us that no one on either side of this war had ever thought to put in their calculations. We came home to a planet that was already rebuilding. That is what we do. We build things, and they fall, and we build them again, slightly different, slightly better, carrying everything we lost with us into the next version. I do not know if we will be good at peace. We have never tried it when we did not have to. But I think, for the first time in my life, that we might actually try.